Our next guest is a Fortean, and we'll find out exactly what that is from him. He is also the editor-in-chief of Pursuit magazine. Welcome, please, John Keel. John, how are you? So you're a Fortean, eh?
Oh, well, I've been trying to outgrow it. Actually,
what is a Fortean? It's spelled F-O-R-T-E-A-N. What is that?
Back in the early part of the century, there was a man named Charles Fort who spent his entire life in the New York Public Library, going through the old scientific journals and old newspapers, and he published a series of books about strange things that turned up in these old journals, like when it would rain frogs in France, or red snow in Switzerland. He kept track of all these things, did a series of books, and we started calling these events Fortean events.
I see.
And today we still keep track.
Now, the two examples you cited there, I've heard of raining the frogs, and it's always a matter of, it's either one, an old wives' tale. Remember the time it rained wives' tales? Or it's disputed in some, they can just say, well, there were frogs in the trees. When it rained, they jumped out.
Well, we have compiled a list of several thousand mysterious things that have fallen from the sky. They documented things. They include things like stone pillars, cannonballs, all kinds of strange things. In China, it once rained raw meat.
No,
and
no.
There's no explanation.
When in China did it rain raw meat?
Well, quite a while ago. It was in the 19th century.
Now, how is it that all the unexplained things took place in the 19th century or before?
They're still taking place.
Give me a recent unexplained thing, other than Amazing Al.
Every January and February, here in the Northeast, we have what we call skyquakes. They get into the papers sometimes. Now, recently, they've been blaming the Concorde for this. But this has been going on. We've been keeping track of this since about 1840.
What is a skyquake?
It's an explosion in the sky. We have no explanation for it. We've got a lot of pseudo-explanations.
Well, how do we know when we hear one or see one?
Because it's like when a jet plane passes over at, Mach 2. It's like breaking the sound barrier. It's an explosion that sometimes shatters windows, and so on. And this has been going on in Connecticut, for example. The Indians had legends about this going way back. So this has been going on for a very long time, but every time it happens, the scientists come up with a new far-fetched explanation for it.
What is the most common or daily unexplained occurrence? I mean, something that we would all say, yeah, that's that thing. We can't explain it. What?
Well, we don't necessarily have daily occurrences, but in recent years, the UFO phenomenon has been very common around the world. Right now, it's going on in Argentina. And while a lot of people think they have an explanation for it, actually, we're just beginning to find out what's really going on with the UFO phenomenon.
UFOs are pretty much, I would guess, if we asked the audience, we'd probably find over half of them said, yeah, they have reason to believe there's something going on out there, I think.
At least 10% of them have probably seen one themselves.
Has anybody here ever seen one of these things? People applaud if you've seen one. And how many of you think there may be something visiting us? What other things fall into the category of unexplained phenomenon?
Well, we have mysterious animals that turn up all over the world.
Like what?
Here in the United States, every year or two, we have kangaroos jumping around Illinois, Connecticut, various parts of the United States. We know there are no kangaroos here. The police go out and chase them, shoot at them. They disappear. We never...
So what is your theory? Where do you think they're coming from?
The same place that the dinosaurs are coming from, because we have dinosaurs turning up every couple of years. About 10 years ago in Italy, the Italian army turned out to chase a dinosaur in the mountains of northern Italy. And they leave dinosaur footprints, and that's the end of them. They can't find where they've been, where they've gone. We've got better monsters than that. We've got our sea serpents, which... We have several lakes in the United States that have sea serpents, not just Loch Ness.
Where is a serpent in this country?
Lake Champlain in New York State.
Really? What is up there?
Henry Hudson, who was the first to go up there, reported seeing, Henry Hudson and his crew saw a sea serpent in Lake Champlain, and every year somebody sees it up there. And nobody has yet organized an expedition to go up there and really look into it.
Well, let's you and me drive up there.
All right, we'll go up there next week.
We'll take the Italian army with us. We'll get those boys. And have we ever photographed this sea serpent?
Well, the one in Loch Ness has been photographed any number of times. Now, movies have been made of it. And the movies have been examined by the RAF and other specialists, and they're obviously some kind of large animal that's living in Loch Ness.
Now, this, what do we have here? This
is a plaster cast of a Bigfoot print. Now, you've all heard of the abominable snowman in the Himalayas. We have in the United States, we have a creature that's variously called Sasquatch or Bigfoot. And he's found not just in Washington and Oregon, but he's found all over the United States, especially in the Mississippi Valley, and even in New Jersey. We have quite a lot of reports out of New Jersey, and that's where this footprint comes from.
This is to you from Uncle Lou and Bob. That's what it says here.
There are two Forteans in New Jersey.
Now,
this is an authentic footprint.
Did you make the cast?
No, they did. They're well-known Forteans. Bob is an airlines pilot, and Uncle Lou is a dental surgeon in New Jersey, and they're very active.
I don't know why that's funny. It just sounds funny.
Dental surgeons make good casts.
How big would this guy be based on this foot?
He would be about 800 pounds, probably 8 or 9 feet tall. And that's what the witnesses are always describing, incredible as it is. And in, of course, the Himalayas, the abominable snowman.
Now that, I think, that we believe in, or at least I do. To me, it seems like, sure, it's possible that something left over that survived the Ice Age or didn't survive it or something, you know, that there may be a missing link and so on and so forth. Some of this other stuff, like the red snow. What was the red snow?
Well, the usual scientific explanation for that is that the sands of the Sahara are somehow drawn into clouds and drop in Switzerland.
Now, I can believe that.
Except there are no red sands in the Sahara Desert. And I've spent part of my life on the Sahara.
What if the sand went up and was somehow oxidized and turned red? Isn't that a possibility?
Well, they've made various chemical analysis of this kind of snow. We've had black snow, too.
Yellow snow, I'm familiar with that. I think we were all waiting for that one, weren't we? Yes.
We just don't know what really causes this phenomenon. The sand explanation doesn't work.
Is there one in particular that keeps you awake at night, that just gnaws at you?
Well, there's some frightening things going on, yeah.
Like what? What are we scared of here?
The animal mutilations that have been going on around the country, especially out west in recent years. But they're also going on in Brazil and France and Australia and Switzerland, Sweden.
And these are not pranks or sick jokes?
Thousands of animals have been slaughtered now by some mysterious group. They drain all the blood from the animals. And they also perform expert operations on the animals, removing certain organs. And veterinarians who have examined these animals say they can't duplicate the operations.
That's amazing. I would also like to know why cab drivers in this city don't speak English, but we'll never figure that one out. We have to pause. Mr. John Keel, accordion, ladies and gentlemen. Edwin Newman will be with us.
About a generation ago, and it gives me the shudders to think that it was a generation ago, I was running around the country, sitting up all night in cemeteries and sitting on hilltops in remote parts of the country, looking for these funny lights in the sky that were everywhere in the 1960s. There was one hilltop in particular that overlooked the Ohio River, where at that time there was a lot of boat traffic on the Ohio River day and night. And these funny lights would come down out of the sky and circle around these boats that were transporting cargo up the Ohio River. And the boatmen would turn on their searchlights and play games with these lights. The lights would jump out of the way of the searchlights. And I was sitting on my hilltop watching these games going on. And I would flash this flashlight at these funny lights, and they would jump out of the way of my flashlight. And so I'd flash in Morse code at these lights, and they would do whatever I ordered them to do. And then later, I decided that instead of using Morse code, I'd make up my own code. And they knew this code, which gave me a lot of concern at the time. And I gradually figured out during this period that we could control these so-called flying saucers. They weren't saucers, they were lights. And I was sitting alone, and one of these lights came down very close to my car, and passed over, there was a wooded area all around me. These hills were all wooded hills. And it passed over these woods, and it seemed to descend right into the forest right next to my car. And the next day when I woke up in my motel room there, my eyes were very sore, like they were full of sand. And this is a common effect of looking at these lights. It's called conjunctivitis. It's like looking into a bright arc light. And so the fact that my eyes were affected was proof that I had seen something there. Now, in the years 1964 to 1968, there was a worldwide epidemic of these lights. And I don't mean that it was an occasional light in the sky. They were everywhere, every damn night of the week. Time magazine did big editorials about it. The New York Times did front-page stories about it. Now, I realized that the best way to tackle this was to pick one or two spots and make them a microcosm of the whole thing, and just study everything in that spot. Learn to know the people, study every event that happened, whether it was related to these things or not. We call them UFOs, but that's really not a good name for them. They were like living lights. These lights had an intelligence of their own. I made Point Pleasant, West Virginia, sort of my headquarters in '66. My first step in arriving in a strange town, a new town, was always to go to the police station and introduce myself to the police. In those days, I carried a pile of press credentials. I was writing in newspaper columns and so on. So I would introduce myself to the police so that they knew I was just another harmless nut. In November of 1966, 4 young people in a car, they were driving past this building, and they saw what looked like a very large man, 6 or 7 feet tall, standing next to this power plant. And for some reason, he scared the death out of them. They were all scared to death. So the boy who was driving hit the accelerator, and they drove out of there at a high speed. And looking back, this thing rose up in the air and followed their car. And they were going over 60 miles an hour on these dirt roads. And this thing was flying right along with them. So they drove straight to the police station. Now, you have to realize in small towns, teenagers do not go to the police station voluntarily. And the police were so convinced by their behavior that they held a press conference the next day. And reporters from the local newspapers, from Charlotte and other cities around there, came to hear this very bizarre story of this flying man. At that time, Batman was very popular on television. So the newspapers labeled this creature Mothman. And that was the beginning of the Mothman caper, I guess you'd call it. And the next year, there were over 100 reports of this Mothman. Some of the people who reported seeing this thing were not only adults, they were responsible adults like bankers and local officials, the lady who was sort of the head of the Chamber of Commerce. In the Christmas season of 1967, in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, there was a bridge called the Silver Bridge that crossed the Ohio River. And on December 15th, 1967, that bridge collapsed, and it was loaded down with cars, people who had been Christmas shopping, and that sort of put a damper on all my investigations. Because I knew some of the people who had gone down with the bridge, and some of these people had been Mothman witnesses. And so I did just one magazine article on the whole subject, and it was a short article. It was about 2,000 words. I gave one talk on the radio about it, on Long John Neville's show, and that was the extent of my involvement. Now today, when you pick up any encyclopedia of the strange or anything, it always says that John Keel is the center of the Mothman thing. And one of the newspapers in West Virginia did a long editorial against me, saying that I was exploiting the situation and making a big profit from it. Of course, little do they know, I made no profit at all from it.
Venusians?
No, the movie coming out about the mountain.
Oh, yeah. I tentatively sold this movie about 3 times, 4 times. Originally, CBS was going to do it. They dropped it. The rights reverted back to me. The most recent one was Paramount was going to do a movie about the Mothman, and they were going to have Richard Gere playing John Keel. But he's too old and ugly. I'd rather have Brad Pitt play. One more question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You had said that, just getting back to the UFOs, that they're hallucinatory in nature, that's your belief. Do you think that all UFO sightings are hallucinatory? Or do you discriminate between some are hallucinatory and there are some that you would give credence to?
No, I've seen a lot of these things myself. The UFOs seem to be a form of energy rather than a mechanical object. And that's why we have all of these injuries, people burned by them and all. It's energy that they're putting out. And I don't think they're mechanical objects. And I decided that years ago, and after having some pretty close sightings of my own, they seem to be masses of energy that have an intelligence of their own. And a lot of witnesses also remark on that. They said, you know, I think that thing was alive. I've heard that phrase over and over again from witnesses. I do not think they're machines.
Do you think that they're from this energy field?
They're from this planet and this energy field, yeah. And I also think if there were people on Mars or Venus or anywhere else, they'd be seeing UFOs too. And they'd be wondering about them. But I think they're definitely related to the human race. If we didn't exist, the UFOs wouldn't exist. It's like when a tree falls, you know, the whole... Now, this may not seem very Fortean to some of you, but everything is interrelated. And the more we study history and the more we study current events, we see that all of these things are linked together in strange ways. That the UFOs, as most of you know who have read my books, I don't think they're extraterrestrial at all. I think they're definitely tied to the human race, and that they react to things that are happening to the human race. I don't think they're vehicles. I think sometimes people see what appears to be vehicles, but they're really hallucinatory. For example, in New Jersey in the 60s, when Ivan Sanderson was still alive, Ivan and I talked to a family in New Jersey who had seen a UFO that was about 1 mile in diameter. And they had a good description of it. It had windows in it and looked like a gigantic flying saucer right out of the movies. And this was in an area of New Jersey where if one family had seen this, then hundreds of other people should have seen it. And Ivan put articles in the newspapers out there in New Jersey asking if anybody else had seen something unusual on that day. And we got a number of UFO reports, but nobody had seen anything 1 mile in diameter. And it was not only, we were able to judge the size of it because the descriptions of the witnesses saw it between 2 mountains. And we measured that distance, and we knew it was about 1 mile between these 2 mountains. And it was low. And the family was attracted to it by the barking of their dog, which is common in a lot of UFO reports. And the husband in the family was the president of a company, a fairly large company in New Jersey, a pretty reliable person. They were not about to make up flying saucer stories to entertain Ivan Sanderson and John Keel. Now, what was our conclusion from that? Why didn't 3,000 other people see the same thing? It had to be some kind of hallucination. And only this one family saw it. And the family down the road didn't see anything. The family in the next town didn't see anything. And certainly if something 1 mile in diameter flew over New Jersey at an altitude of a couple of thousand feet, a lot of people would have seen it. So this is one of the many, many cases that convinced me that there's a hallucinatory process involved in this. And no matter how reliable the witness is, what they see can be questioned. The is true in many of our Bigfoot cases and strange monster cases, that the people see some image that's planted in their mind, and the creature itself probably doesn't exist at all, at least not as the creature that's seen. These predictions were not based on psychic ability. They're based on projections. You take what's happening now and project it into the future. And there are a few people who have been doing this. There are a lot of people who talk about cycles and so on, but it goes beyond cycles. And the way to understand it is you have to understand history. There are, every few years, there's what we call a pivotal year, when everything comes together at once in 1 year. And we can see, looking backwards, we can see these pivotal years throughout history. And looking forward, we can see the ones that are coming up. Around 500 BC, 2,500 years ago, in Persia, there was a man named Zoroaster. Zoroaster was talking to entities. He was talking to an entity called Mazda. Then he came up with the concept of devils and angels, which of course became the foundation for the Jewish and Christian religions. In that century, philosophy and religion all over the world changed. And yet the people in Persia had no idea that it was happening in China. People in China had no idea it was happening in India. And it was a new age. So we can say that century was a pivotal century. But the year that most people know about was 1848, which was a major pivotal year for the entire world on every level. In England, there was a fellow named Karl Marx who came up with an idea that he called communism. There were more than 50 revolutions around the world that year. There were scores of assassinations, political assassinations. In the United States, here in New York State, a couple of young girls started hearing rappings in their walls of their little house that they lived in. And they were the Fox sisters. And they founded spiritualism that year. And that was a major event in the 19th century. Spiritualism gripped the entire country for many years. There were many other pivotal years, and you've lived through a couple of them. Now, 1968 was a major pivotal year, and there again, the books are still appearing on it. We not only had political assassinations in 1968, but there was a revolution in France. There were all kinds of upheavals all over the world. The war in Vietnam, of course, got mired down. We were also on the threshold of space, about to go into space. The following year we did. Also, in 1968, we had a major flying saucer wave. There are literally hundreds of books on that flying saucer wave. People in every state wrote books about just the sightings in their own state. One of the next big pivotal years that you all lived through was 1973. Now, 1973 was a very remarkable year, and most of the people who lived through it don't even realize it now. It started out, we had a vice president named Spiro Agnew, and it turned out he was taking bribes, so they threw him out of office. They were almost put him in jail. Of course, Watergate happened the year before, and the Watergate thing started building up. But we also were in very serious economic trouble. In the 1960s, the Vietnamese War was costing us $1 billion a day. And in order to pay for it, we started printing money where there was no gold to back it up. And then, because I'm this tremendous prophet, that year I bought a car that got 35 miles to the gallon. I bought a Carmen Ghia, which was made by Volkswagen. Everybody else had a car that got 8 miles to the gallon. That fall, of course, we had our phony oil shortage. You all remember that, the long lines and all. Now, in France, after that oil shortage was over, France held a trial of all of their leading oil men. They put them all in jail. We should have done that here. Now, in October of 1973, we suddenly had a UFO wave, a major UFO wave. And for 2 weeks, the newspapers didn't carry anything else but UFO news. It was all very exciting to the UFO buffs and the 14s who were following UFO stuff. And then the Arabs attacked Israel. Now, the newspapers and the news media here in the United States, who were all zeroed in on UFOs, and in fact, NBC had teams running around the country interviewing UFO witnesses. Suddenly the war started, and they had to divert all of their media to the war. And the news on the UFOs stopped cold. But the UFO sightings continued. Now, most of the UFO buffs still erroneously say that 1973 was the big year in the 70s for UFOs. It wasn't. 1975 was the big year. And the UFO sightings and other 14 things continued to build up in 74. And then in 75, we had them everywhere. We had everything. We had Bigfoot sightings. We had sea serpent sightings. We had all kinds of UFO sightings and landings and abductions. And it was all in 1975, not in 73. By 1975, when we had all of these 14 things going on, a lot of people had dropped out of the UFO scene and the 14 scene. In the 60s, with a big wave of the 1960s, literally millions of people took an interest in UFOs, and we had networks all over the country and all over the world watching the UFO sightings and other events. But by 1975, there were only a handful of people who were still interested, were still watching. So the news media was also rather disinterested. And it's only in recent years that all this stuff has trickled in, and you can see how 1975 was the big year for those kinds of things. Now, this may not seem very Fortean to some of you, but everything is interrelated. And the more we study history and the more we study current events, we see that all of these things are linked together in strange ways. That the UFOs, as most of you know who have read my books, I don't think they're extraterrestrial at all. I think they're definitely tied to the human race, and that they react to things that are happening to the human race. I don't think they're vehicles. I think sometimes people see what appears to be vehicles, but they're really hallucinatory. And no matter how reliable the witness is, what they see can be questioned. The same is true in many of our Bigfoot cases and the strange monster cases, that the people see some image that's planted in their mind, and the creature itself probably doesn't exist at all, at least not as the creature that's seen. When I was in India, I was impressed at the number of people who were seeing the Indian gods, multi-armed gods and all. Whatever your belief is, these manifestations are going to assume that form.
Now, you mentioned that there's a wave of UFO activity associated with collapse in the economy. What is the reason for that?
During the Black Plague, which was in the 14th century, when you go and look through the records about the Black Plague and the books about the Black Plague, they keep referring to mysterious atmospheric phenomena occurring during the Black Plague. And they're describing UFO sightings. How all these poor people were dying. There were all these mysterious things were buzzing around the skies of Europe. And it took them a long time to figure out that the flea was bringing them the Black Plague. But I think every time the human race is in jeopardy in any fashion, whether it's economically or militarily, we start seeing UFOs all over the place.
So why is that? Can you?
If I knew why, I'd be rich. I'd be publishing books that you'd all be reading. But I'm afraid I can't answer that.
The universities around the country have been studying this subject for many years, and they know how much about it as I do. The subject is called cosmology. shit. Anyone who spend their whole lives looking for microscopes, studying manure. In a way, this has been part of my study of UFOs and strange phenomena. Back about 35 years ago in West Virginia, people were seeing a giant bird, and I mean a giant bird. This thing was like 7 feet tall, walking. They just called it the Mothman. And I was down there, because there were so many witnesses to this, I said, by God, this bird must exist, and I'm going to catch it. I started looking for footprints and things like that. And in the course of that, I realized that this giant bird existed. It had to take a crap once in a while. So I was going around West Virginia looking at bird shit. I figured
the biggest secrets during World War II, most of you probably don't even remember, was the Norden boring bomb site and a project called MAGIC. Now, MAGIC has been the subject of God knows how many movies, novels, documentaries, and does anybody here know what MAGIC was about? Yeah. It was the code breaking, yes. And the people who worked on that, when they were taken into the project, they were told simply, if you mention this even to your wife, we'll shoot you. It was that secret. The Norden bomb site enabled airplanes at 30,000 feet to drop a bomb down a smokestack. In the pre-computer days, it was a computer. Now, everybody thinks that the atomic bomb was the biggest secret, and it wasn't. A lot of people knew about it. One of the great legends of the science fiction world is that in 1944, a science fiction magazine came out with a story that gave all the details of the atom bomb. And the story went on that the FBI rushed around to all the newsstands and bought up all the copies of this magazine. Well, if they did that, then a copy of that magazine would be worth $100,000 today if you could find one, right? So get out your wallets. It was called Astounding Science Fiction, and it was March 1944, over a year before we started dropping atom bombs. Actually, they did not collect copies of this from the newsstands, but they did. After about 2 weeks after the magazine came out on the newsstands, the author of this story, had heard a knock on his door, and it was the FBI. And they came and they said, where the hell did you get all this information? And he showed them. He had science magazines and so on, and he had put it together from stuff that had been published in obscure scientific journals and journals for physicists and things. In the 1940s, the late 1940s, 1945, the Japanese didn't have an atom bomb. So they came up with something that only the Japanese could have thought of. First of all, they discovered the jet stream. The Japanese made up balloons out of paper, and they made up these 30-foot balloons. And they had all of the teenagers and children of Japan working, making these balloons. And they launched 10,000 of them against the United States from Japan. And they were armed with bombs. And the idea was that they would fly across the Pacific on the jet stream, and they would drop their bombs on the United States. Well, these balloons were called Fugo balloons, which means fire balloons. And some of these bombs actually did reach the United States. And that's a whole other story. There are books devoted to that, written by aviation historians. When the war ended, and we discovered, well, we knew the Japanese were sending over the balloons, and just a year ago, the New York Times revealed the Japanese ultimate plan was to put diseases in these balloons, like anthrax, and send that to the United States. But they never got that far.
During
curious about, since the Pluto balloon, since it was so secret and the government didn't make any statement, how did they manage to keep it secret when they were found, when they actually...
Because, as I say, the FBI or the Army would go into where the balloon was found, and they would tell everybody, listen, we don't want the Japanese to know that this reached us. And there are books filled with pictures of all this. There are many books on this. Undoubtedly, a lot of these balloons caused some of the flying saucer sightings because they were reflective, so that they would reflect the heat of the sun. If they didn't, they would go too high and they'd explode. I've been a government consultant off and on all my life. When I was 23 years old, I was working for the Department of Army in a radio station. In the early 1970s, I took a job with HEW. The first thing that baffled me was why did it, and this is 25 years ago, why everything cost twice as much for the government. If the government was, say, buying a rubber stamp that cost you 50 cents, the government would pay $5 for the same rubber stamp. And I found out very quickly why. It costs the government so much because the government is so slow in paying. If the government buys toilet seats from a manufacturer, it takes them a year or 2 years to pay the manufacturer. And meanwhile, he's got to meet his expenses. So he charges them, instead of charging them $4.95 for a toilet seat, he charges them $500 for a toilet seat. One big project of Social Security was they put out a comic book in Spanish, and they printed 100,000 of these, and they distributed 5,000 of these comic books, which cost a fortune. It was a huge staff to put it together, and they ultimately got rid of less than 5,000 of them. Anybody have a question there?
Yeah, what were the secrets that the Air Force...
The secret is all money. They don't want us to know how much anything costs. They tell you that we're now building 30 stealth bombers at $1 billion a piece, but then with the cost overruns and everything, when it's all... They really don't know what any of this stuff costs.
You really can't keep a good hoax down. H.L. Mencken, he wrote how the bathtub was invented and how the first bathtub was installed in the White House by Millard Fillmore. 3 or 4 times, maybe even more than that, he wrote additional pieces saying it was all a hoax and nothing was true. You can still read in guidebooks that Millard Fillmore installed the first bathtub in the White House. And the thing keeps resurfacing. And another hoax you can't keep down is Mencken wrote a story again in 1917 as to how the spirit of St. George and the bowmen who were under Henry V at Agincourt appeared at the Battle of Mons and has helped the British soldiers to escape from the German advance. It's called the Angel of Mons. And this is widely believed, although Mencken never intended it to be anything more than just a story that he dreamt up one afternoon.
There's been a tremendous amount of hoaxing within science for reasons that are not very noble, and scientists are always sort of poo-pooing many claims that, like in parapsychology or cryptozoology or whatever, that, oh, that's probably just a hoax, and they use that to dismiss it. But when a claim is made within some scientific area, very few people say, oh, that's probably just a hoax. They tend to trust each other as scientists, and as a result of that, scientists can often get away with hoaxing. There's the Piltdown case you mentioned, which is one of the classics, perhaps the classic of the century, and we still don't know who did it. Perhaps less well known is Sir Cyril Burt in Britain. Sir Cyril Burt was a psychologist who did a lot of studies, or supposedly did a lot of studies earlier in the century, and he used subjects. He had 2 researchers working with him, and he used a lot of subjects. He did a lot of work with children and with twins, and published a tremendous amount of data. And that data was so compelling that, in fact, the establishment and the British government implemented educational programs and tests. But we had to take that horrible 11 plus at 11. And it's all because of Sir Cyril Burt. Well, a few years ago, it turns out that the 2 colleagues who worked with Sir Cyril Burt on this never existed. They were completely fabricated peoples. And it turned out most of the data, a lot of it was fudged, fabricated, and Sir Cyril got knighted. He was one of the top psychologists in Britain. And there's a case in point. And there's certainly, if not hoaxing, there has certainly been and is a lot of what's called fudging. That basically the main body of your case is okay, solid, but you fudge some data just to make it more complete, to make it look more accurate. And they've even found that Galileo fudged some of his data. Basically he was right, but there was a little fudging there. And it's not just in anomalies or in Forteana.
I think ufology has probably had more hoaxes than any other Fortean field.
Extremely complicated and long-term hoaxes can be perpetrated, and it should be remembered for all other fields.
There's one going on right now with the MJ-12 papers, which is an absurd document. The MJ-12 paper has gripped the UFO community, and they've chosen sides on it. If anybody would sit down and read it word for word, they'd see it's an absurd hoax, a badly done hoax. And if they would bother to get any kind of briefing paper from the White House, and the White House will supply these, because they get 50 to 100 a week, you will see that the format and all the way it's laid out is completely wrong. Whoever did it was not only an amateur, but he was a rank amateur. He didn't know anything about the government, he didn't know anything about the military, and yet the UFO buffs have taken this MJ-12 thing to their hearts, and they're battling over it right now. And this will end up in all of the UFO books for the next 20 years as a real thing. One of Gray Barker's hoaxes, the best one probably, is the Edwards Air Force Base hoax, which you've all read about in UFO books. Gray Barker put out a memo about in the form of a letter claiming that UFO had landed at Edwards Air Force Base, and the group of distinguished people, including President Eisenhower, had visited the base to talk to these UFO people. And to give himself away, Gray included in the list of famous people who went there names of all of his friends. He listed his friends. Nobody ever checked this memo out, and it's now been published around the world as one of the great UFO incidents of the 1950s. And Gray Barker, wherever he is still laughing.
There's another important issue that I want to raise. We've seen a lot of investigators in the UFO field, particularly, and other fields as well, however, who start off as excellent investigators, excellent ufologists, excellent whatever they're investigating, do high-quality work, and then years later, they start falling for these absurd hoaxes and they go off the deep end. And it's a very curious phenomenon. We're seeing more and more of it in recent years. And as I thought about this, I thought, is it a desensitization process whereby people in the field are exposed to so much strangeness, legitimate strangeness in the phenomena, that they become desensitized to it, that nothing surprises them anymore. And consequently, the outrageous elements in a hoax, they take in stride like every other strange thing that they've seen.
Professional writers usually, at some point, they study a thing that's called suspension of disbelief. When you go to a James Bond movie, you know it's garbage. You know that these things could never happen to anybody, but you accept them while you're watching the movie. And it's the same process, except sort of extended into your private life. When you're a scientist or an investigator of strange things, after a while, you've heard so many strange things that you know you believe everything.
This is a problem that has long faced people in psychical research. About 50 years ago, a man named Walter Franklin Prince wrote a really fascinating book called The Enchanted Boundary. And his thesis was that when people come into these Fortean or paranormal areas, they sometimes lose their normal critical senses, and they pass over what is called the enchanted boundary. And this happens very, very abruptly. There's a very skeptical investigator named Eric Dingwall, who later became a member of PSYCOP. One of the most celebrated mediumistic cases in psychical research is that of Marjorie. who's a well-known fraud. Dingwall came over from England, and in the first few days, he was just totally flabbergasted, and he admitted that his whole world changed within just a day or two of his encounter. And he said if he had later found a little more skeptical information, he would have become very, very credulous. So there's a whole range of investigators who, once they have committed, they no longer are nearly so concerned with their controls and ruling out sensory cues and statistical artifacts. It's something people have to continually guard against. And the only way to do that is to have a sympathetic yet critical community who can engage in peer review, sometimes behind-the-scenes confrontation, sometimes you have to go public.
I think we've left out the most important category of all, which is practical jokes. And there was a wonderful book published in the late 1940s by H. Allen Smith called The Complete Practical Joker. It is a hilarious book, and he covers especially the career of Hugh Troy, a man who did marvelous practical jokes. When there was an exhibit of Van Gogh's paintings, Hugh Troy took an old piece of old hamburger, and he fashioned an ear out of it. And he put this in a cushioned box, and then he made up a little sign, very fancy sign, painted, Van Gogh's ear. And he slipped this into the museum that had the Van Gogh exhibit and put it on a table. And crowds were gathering around, looking at Van Gogh's ear. I'm sure that you also want to hear about the Fugo balloons from Japan. We have a lot of new Fugo information. For those of you who've never heard of the Fugo balloons, at the end of the Second World War, the Japanese had this scheme of bombing the United States with balloons. And they built 9,000 balloons. And they filled them with hydrogen, which is very explosive, and loaded them down with bombs and sent them across the Pacific, which was 3,000 miles, by the Gulf Stream. And some of these balloons actually reached the United States and dropped their bombs on the United States. And these balloons, most of them self-destructed. They were designed to self-destruct. But a couple of hundred of them, for various reasons, did not self-destruct. And they landed in different parts of the West, especially, and where the government retrieved them. And this started a lot of the rumors of government secrecy and strange objects coming out of the sky. And the Japanese call these balloons Fugo balloons. And as I pointed out before and in some articles, it's very likely that what was found at Roswell, New Mexico, was the remains of a Fugo balloon. There are 7 museums in the United States that have a display of Fugo balloons. The Smithsonian had a fully rigged Fugo balloon on display for some years. And some of the museums in Oregon and Washington have Fugo balloon material on display. So anyone who reads the books on Roswell, if you're really interested in it, you can go to one of these museums and see the kind of material that was found at Roswell, because it fits the description of the Roswell witnesses exactly. Only at Roswell did they think that it was something else. Usually when they find a Fugo balloon, people are smart enough to figure out, gee, it must be a balloon. At Roswell, they said, gee, it must be a flying saucer. We're still finding these damn things. In North Dakota in 1990, they found one in the Black Hills. It had probably been there for 45 years. And they found the remains of it. Of course, after 45 years, a lot of it just rotted away. But they found enough so they could identify it as a Fugo balloon. In 1990, the Japanese television network sent a camera team to the United States, and they toured the United States, and they interviewed all the Fugo balloon witnesses who were still alive. There were a lot of them. And then they did a 2-hour documentary on Fugo balloons on December 7th, 1991. And their approach was, gee, we're sorry we did this. And the Japanese school children last year
made thousands of origami, origami birds and things out of paper, and sent this to Oregon, to the state of Oregon, as a gift in tribute to the people. Some people in Oregon had been killed by these bombs, as a tribute to these people who had died in the Fugo balloon attacks. There is a college professor here in the United States he's Japanese and I can't pronounce his name, but he sort of made a hobby out of the Fugo balloons, and he's the leading expert on it, and he's talked to all the witnesses. After I did some articles on it, we got some strange letters from people who recalled seeing these during the war and after the war. And I got 3 letters in particular that are very interesting and that was now checking out. People who claimed that some of these balloons were manned, and they saw these balloons. One woman was living near Hanford, which is an atomic bomb plant, and she saw this balloon very close to the ground, and there was something in it that she thought at first was a monkey. And when she got closer to it, she realized that it was a little man. And of course, Japanese were small in stature, and if you're going to build balloons to cross the Pacific, you want a small person, lightweight person, to be in them. And she said that right after she watched this balloon bounce across the landscape and fly away, several jeeps pulled up with American soldiers in them, and one of the officers asked her not to mention this to anybody. This was a practice at the time. They didn't want the Japanese to find out that these balloons were getting here, and so they kept most of it out of the newspapers. And this started, in a way, a lot of our Men in Black kind of stories that we later heard in the UFO field. Because the FBI also would call students together in a schoolroom and warn them that these balloon bombs were coming, and that if they ever saw one, they should not, spread the news. They should keep it to themselves. One of these balloons did get into a very small newspaper out west, and within 2 weeks, the story appeared in the Japanese newspapers in Japan. That's how good their spy system was. So the government plan to keep it a secret was quite effective. And there are books about this secrecy, very well documented books. There's one by a man named Bert Weber called The Silent Siege. But if the Japanese were able to send over even a few manned balloons, then we would have another explanation for a lot of the stories that came out immediately after the war of the government picking up little men from the desert and so on. There are a number of these stories are being revived now by the Roswell fans. It's very likely that maybe a dozen of these balloons had been manned, because they were planning to do that on a big scale, but they never did it. That is, they didn't send over thousands of balloons with men in them, but they may have sent over a few, half dozen or a dozen, just to see if it would work. And that's probably what all of these stories are about. We know that there was one crash saucer story from Mexico that was a Fugo balloon story, but at the time, nobody knew about Fugo balloons, and the American Army went into Mexico and carried out the remains of the Fugo balloon. And the story appears in Frank Scully's book, which was published in 1950.
I went to New York when I was 17, and within a very short time I was editor of a poetry magazine, and also at that time television was just starting up. One of the first stations was WABD, and it was in the old Wanamaker building, which was a department store. And in the basement of the department store, they set up a very primitive television station. And everybody there in the station worked for nothing and very close to it, because television was very primitive and only a handful of people had TV sets. Well, I used to hang around there, and I was working on a newspaper, and I would hang around there in my spare time and watch how everything was going. and they finally started paying me $4 a week. That was big salary in television. So I really was a pioneer in television. And here we all knew that television was going to be really big. But the Korean War started, and my natural patriotic instinct was to defend my country and become a big war hero. In other words, they caught me trying to cross the Canadian border. And they dragged me into the army. They shipped all the black guys to Korea, and they shipped all the white guys to Europe. And Europe was a pretty good place to go. We got our orders, which is a sheet of paper with nothing but gobbledygook on it. Unless you know what all these phrases and initials mean, you don't know where you're going and how you're going to get there and what they're going to do to you when you do get there. So our orders said we were going to the 7707 AFN company, and nobody knew what the hell that was. So I go, figure out I'm going to be doing autopsies. So we arrived in Frankfurt, and all these soldiers got off the train, and there were fleets of trucks waiting for them. And they all climbed into the backs of the trucks. But we couldn't find our truck. George and I were running around saying, where the hell is the AFN company? And a limousine pulled up. Honest to God, a limousine pulled up, and a German driver got out. And the Germans in those days, they probably still do, they loved uniforms. This guy was wearing big boots and a big leather coat. And he said, is this Herr Keel? And I said, yeah, and he'd come for us. So we got into the limousine. All these other soldiers that we had ridden on the train with, they were pretty disgusted. So we got into the limousine. We started off going outside of Frankfurt. And we asked the driver, are we going to live in a tent? He said, no. You live in a castle. he pulled into a town called Herbst, and there was a bloody castle. And it was the Von Breuning Castle. Now, we had a system in those days, and the Army had a system, where, Germany was absolutely leveled, but anything that was standing, the U.S. Army took it. And they seized this castle and turned it into a radio station. That was what AFN stood for, was the American Forces Network. And we were suddenly, our basic training had been a terrible nightmare, and now we were suddenly living in luxury. And we had a maid who came in and made our beds and swept the floors and everything. And our cooks in the Army mess hall there didn't serve Army food. They traded it on the German black market for steaks and things. And they were very good cooks. They were carefully selected cooks. So George was assigned to the newsroom of the radio station. By the way, this is probably the biggest radio network in the world at that time. And I was assigned to production. And I was to produce radio shows. I knew a little bit about television, but I didn't know much about radio. So naturally, they made me a big shot there. Now, in 1951, I was doing a lot of shows. For example, we had a show called something like a Profile of a Leader. And we were supposed to do a program every week about one of the generals living in Europe. And so they had the dullest biographies. They went to this school and that school. And a few of them had been in an actual battle. And after a while, we got pretty fed up with these dull biographies, and we started inventing generals. And nobody ever caught on to it. And from then on, every week you heard machine guns going, and the general saved his whole command. And nobody ever questioned it. And this station was heard all over Europe, and including England. When my 2 years in the Army was up, I had a big debate with myself. By this time, I had a German girlfriend. incidentally, because of the war, most of the young men our ages had been killed, German men had been killed in the war. And so there were like 35 or 40 girls our age to every German man. So the German girls had a problem. And we didn't. I started dating a girl who was the daughter of a judge in Hamburg. And of course, nobody in Germany at that time had been a Nazi. But you couldn't be a judge in Germany during the war years unless you were a Nazi. So I decided to take my discharge in Europe. And they offered me a civilian job with the radio station. Now I was really a big shot. I was a suit. And so I got out of the Army in Frankfurt. At that time in the United States, people were earning something like $40, $50 a week. And there I was getting $200 a week. Wow. And yeah, there's quite a difference. And I was gaining power all the time. They couldn't do without me. But after a year of that, I had been in Germany 3 years. And Germany was then a very grim place. As I said, most of the cities were in ruins. And I decided, and this you can only do this when you're 22 years old and make this kind of stupid decision. I decided to quit. And I said, I'm going back to Egypt. Because when I was in Egypt, I felt this strange kinship. Most people feel this when they go to Egypt. They feel that we have a link with ancient Egypt, not that the modern Egyptians are birds. And so I went back, and I had all the press credentials in the world. And I interviewed Gamal Nasser like 4 times. He was then president of Egypt. And I went to many of the pyramids. I got lost in the desert and all. And of course, I didn't have much money. And I had an agent in New York who was supposed to sell my stories. But the problem was, he sold everything I wrote, but it would take a year to get the damn money. So there were many times when I was broke. But I had all these press credentials, so when money was getting thin, I would go, say, to the Aswan Dam or Luxor, and I'd check into the most expensive hotel. And because I had official Egyptian press cards, they would tear up the check when I left. And I rode on all the trains and things for free because I had these press cards. So I was turning into an expert freeloader. That was the secret, because in those days, the dollar was king. This movie is about 20 minutes long. It's very old and it's full of splices. And let's hope that it doesn't break anywhere. Talking my head off. Still public? Okay. We're coming out with a limited edition soon. Where is it? This is in Cairo. These fellows are sitting in an outdoor cafe smoking their version of pop. It's called Hobbly Bobbly. I haven't seen this for a long time. The colors are completely gone. That's my German girlfriend, Lita. The book is dedicated to She's trying to work a big on a camel and pose. Now, behind the pyramid, there were 3 tiny pyramids. And nobody knows why. They didn't find anything. This is the entrance to one of those tiny pyramids. And here comes our hero now. I was wearing a necktie. In those days, everybody wore a necktie. I think I had a jacket too, but Rita was holding it while I was fooling around with my light meter. figured a lot of crap with me on that photograph. People must have spent years digging through those little pyramids, and then they didn't find anything. This is a street magician. Golly, man. Some of them were very skillful, and usually they wore a turban because they would hide things in the hair in the turban. And they always wanted me to teach them card tricks. They had all these wonderful ancient tricks, and now they wanted to learn card tricks. That's a European trick. You must have bought that by mail. That's a bird, it's a toy bird. It shows you the empty basket. He's a real showman, this guy.
Special effect.
These are miracles of mysterious bodies. A tree has grown there. Pretty dumb trick. That's a world famous magic trick, the mango tree trick. This is a trick that's thousands of years old. And it was very hard to find anybody who could do real ancient tricks. Cups and balls. Absolutely spellbinding. Oh, this is a snake charmer trick. If they think they've got a wealthy tourist watching them, they let the snake bite them. And then the tourist feels sorry for them and gives them big bucks. He let it bite him, see? They always did that to me. And I got a lot of snake charmers. I finally started telling them, please don't let it bite you. I'm not going to give you any more money for that. I did that with the flute. The cobra, you shake the flute and the cobra is trying to strike at the flute. Cobras can't hear. Snakes can't hear. But that's all showmanship when you see a snake charmer doing that. When I came back to New York, I had 3 cobras and a boa constrictor with me. And the publisher of the book moved me into a pet store, in the window of a pet store in Times Square. And every day at 3 o'clock I'd get in the window and charm the snake.
The things you do in smart books, right?
Yeah. Oh, thank God.
They have that certain title. What about Lita?
A story in itself. Lita and I were together for 7 years, and finally, I kept going away, traveling, and finally, I came back to New York and brought her over a few months later, and we did nothing but fight when we were in New York. And the 7-year relationship just fell apart. I watched Casablanca last night. It reminds me a lot. Lita and I have Cairo. Who wants it? Thank you very much.